Ruth believed that freedom would bring her joy, but instead, it became a silent torment. Her husband, Larry, had sacrificed his manhood to free her from a spiritual bond with her spirit husband. Now, Larry's condition, a 1-inch manhood and a dwindling intimacy, was tearing their marriage apart. Ruth lived with guilt, frustration, and an undeniable longing she couldn't explain. One quiet evening, when Ruth first heard the low hum of a car pulling into their driveway, she peeked through the living room curtains, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Peter stepping out. Tall and confident, with a warm smile that could melt ice, Peter looked like the kind of man who carried light into every room he entered. His eyes sparkled under the evening sun, and Ruth felt her breath hitch. "Why does he look so charming?" she whispered to herself, her cheeks flushing. Shaking her head, she tried to push the thought away. "He's just Larry's younger brother, that's all," she reminded herself. Peter was visiting for the holidays, and Ruth knew she should be excited to host him, but something about his presence unsettled her. As the days passed, her unease grew into something she couldn't quite name, a mix of longing and guilt. She found herself lingering in the kitchen whenever Peter walked in, her heart racing whenever their eyes met. She tried to fight the feelings that swirled within her. Late at night, she would sit on the edge of her bed, gripping the sheets tightly. "This isn't right," she whispered into the silence. "This isn't who I am." But no matter how hard she tried, the feelings wouldn't go away. One chilly morning, Larry woke up early, his face somber. He gently nudged Ruth awake. "Baby, we need to talk," he whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. Ruth's heart pounded as she sat up. She was certain she knew what was coming. Her mind raced back to that terrible night when, in frustration, she had lashed out at him. She had said things she couldn't take back, words that cut him deeper than she ever intended. "Larry," she began, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry. I know what you want to say, but please let me speak first." Larry paused, his eyes wide with surprise. "I shouldn't have said those things to you," Ruth continued, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know what came over me. You've done so much for me, and I—" Her voice broke as she reached for his hand. "I love you, Larry. Please, let's forget I ever said those awful things." Larry's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he listened to her. "Ruth," he said softly, his voice cracking, "I know I haven't been perfect, and I know this isn't easy for you, but I'm doing my best. For us." Ruth nodded, her tears falling freely now. She leaned forward, resting her head on his chest, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal again. They sat there in silence, holding on to each other as if the world outside didn't exist. The next morning, Larry kissed Ruth goodbye before heading to work. "I'll be home early tonight," he said, flashing her a warm smile. "Maybe we can have dinner together, just the two of us?" Ruth nodded, forcing a smile. "I'd like that," she replied. But as the door closed behind him, Ruth felt a wave of unease wash over her. She glanced at the clock and realized it was time to take Peter his breakfast. Ruth stood outside Peter's door, holding the breakfast tray in trembling hands. She had spent the morning convincing herself she could handle this, that her feelings for Peter were nothing but a moment of weakness. "It's just breakfast," she whispered to herself. "Just take it to him and leave." Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door. "Come in," Peter's voice called out. Ruth pushed the door open and her heart skipped a beat. Peter stood near the window, tying a sparkling white towel around his waist. Water dripped from his hair and slid down his toned chest. His body seemed to glow in the sunlight streaming through the window. "Oh, I'm sorry," Ruth stammered, quickly looking at the floor. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Her cheeks burned as her eyes refused to stay down. She stole quick glances, her pulse racing uncontrollably. Peter smiled and took a step closer. "Relax, Ruth," he said in a low, smooth voice. He reached out, gently lifting her chin so she could meet his gaze. "I know you like me," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I've seen the way you look at me. You can't hide it." Ruth's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought Peter might hear it. "Step back," she whispered, though her voice wavered. Peter smirked, taking another step closer. You can't deny it, Ruth. I know you feel it, and don't worry, Larry doesn't have to know. Ruth froze, her thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and temptation. Peter leaned in, his lips inches from hers. Her body betrayed her, longing for something she knew she shouldn't want. "No!" she suddenly screamed, her voice breaking the tension. She shoved Peter away with all her strength. "No, Peter, I can't do this! Larry doesn't deserve this!" Without waiting for his response, she turned and bolted from the room, tears streaming down her face. She ran to the kitchen, clutching the counter for support as she tried to catch her breath. "What is wrong with me?" She questioned herself in tears. That evening, when Larry came home, he noticed Ruth's unusual quietness. "Babe, are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Ruth forced a weak smile. "Yes, I'm fine," she lied, avoiding his gaze. Larry studied her for a moment before sitting beside her on the couch. "Are you sure? You've been so distant lately?" Ruth hesitated, her mind racing. "Actually, I've been meaning to say something," she said softly, trying to steady her voice. Larry leaned closer. "What is it, Ruth?" She swallowed hard, her hands trembling. I think we need some privacy. Time to reconnect, just the two of us. Our marriage has been tested so much recently." Larry's brow furrowed. "You want me to send my brother away?" he asked, his tone laced with surprise. "No, that's not what I mean," Ruth said quickly, shaking her head. It's been hard lately. I feel like we need to focus on us." Larry nodded slowly. "Peter is only here for the holidays, Ruth. He'll be gone soon. Let's make the most of this time." Ruth nodded, though her chest felt heavy. She wanted to tell Larry everything but couldn't find the right words. Days passed, and Ruth's struggle only grew. The more she tried to suppress her feelings for Peter, the more distant she became from Larry. Every touch from her husband felt like a reminder of her guilt. One afternoon, she locked herself in her room, burying her face in her hands. In desperation, she picked up her phone and called her best friend, Vivian, or V, as she called her. "V, I'm dying inside," Ruth said through tears. "I don't know what's wrong with me." V's voice was calm and steady. "Ruth, breathe. Tell me what's going on." Ruth poured out her heart, confessing everything. Her frustration with Larry, her growing feelings for Peter, and the guilt that was eating her alive. "I have tried to tell my husband to make Peter leave, but he doesn't seem to understand. He thinks I'm chasing her brother away." "V, I'm tired," she said. After a moment of silence, V spoke. "I have an idea. I'll come stay with you for a few days, at least until Peter leaves. Maybe my presence will help you keep your head clear when Larry isn't around." Ruth hesitated, but the idea sounded like a lifeline. "You'd do that for me?" "Of course," V said. "What are friends for?" 2 days later, V arrived. Larry, unaware of the real reason for her visit, greeted her warmly at the door. "Ruth has talked a lot about you," Larry said with a smile. "It's so good to finally meet you in person." "It's good to meet you too," V replied. "I'm sorry I missed the wedding. I was out of the country at the time." Larry waved it off. "Don't worry about it. Make yourself at home." Ruth led V to her room, and the two friends sat down to catch up. "Wow, Ruth," V said, glancing at Larry as he walked past the door. "You didn't tell me your husband was this handsome. I mean, I saw pictures, but he looks even better in real life." Ruth chuckled nervously, brushing off the comment. But as the two women laughed and talked, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that V's arrival might bring more complications than solutions. V's stay in the house brought Ruth a sense of calm she hadn't felt in a while. For the first few days, having her best friend around felt like a lifeline. They laughed, cooked together, and even talked late into the night like old times. Ruth felt like she could finally breathe. But behind closed doors, V was a storm waiting to break. Late one night, as she lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, jealousy began to eat away at her. "Why is Ruth always the lucky one?" V whispered bitterly to herself. "Since we were kids, she's always had everything. Good grades, the perfect job, and now this." Her eyes flickered toward the photo of Ruth and Larry on the bedside table, their smiles glowing in the frame. "Just look at her husband. Handsome, rich, and kind. He treats her like a queen. And me?" V scoffed, tears of anger welling up in her eyes. "No man, no life. Just heartbreak after heartbreak. No, I won't let this continue." V sat up, her jaw clenched as she made a silent vow. She can't have it all. Not this time. Meanwhile, Ruth was battling her own demons. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Ruth decided to confide in her best friend. She couldn't keep her feelings bottled up any longer. "V," Ruth began hesitantly, her voice trembling. "I don't know how much longer I can do this. I feel like my marriage was a mistake from the start." V leaned forward, feigning concern. "What do you mean, Ruth? Larry is a good man." Ruth nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. "He is. He's kind, loving, and has done so much for me, but—" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "I can't stop thinking about Peter. It's driving me insane." V's eyes sparkled with interest, though she masked it with a concerned expression. "What are you saying, Ruth?" "I mean, every time I see Peter, my heart races. I try to push these feelings away, but they keep coming back. Larry tries so hard to make me happy, but the more he tries, the more distant I feel. It's like my heart doesn't belong to him anymore." Ruth broke down, covering her face with her hands. "I'm a terrible wife, V. I don't know what's wrong with me." V placed a comforting hand on Ruth's shoulder, but her mind was racing. She quickly pulled out her phone, secretly recording the entire conversation. "What kind of freedom is this?" she cried. "I'm trapped all over again." "Ruth, listen to me," V said softly, her tone laced with false sympathy. "You can't keep living like this. If you're not happy, you need to think about yourself for once. Leave Larry if you have to." "No, I can't," Ruth replied, shaking her head. "Larry has been so good to me. I can't betray him." V sighed dramatically. "Whatever he had done for you isn't worth sacrificing your happiness, Ruth. Trust me." The following morning, Ruth prepared breakfast as usual. V has been the one serving Peter's food since she came, but that day, she asked V to take Peter's food to his room. "I'm not feeling well," V said, faking a cough. "Can you take it instead?" Ruth hesitated, her heart pounding. She didn't want to go anywhere near Peter, but she didn't want to seem suspicious either. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the tray and walked to Peter's room. When she entered, Peter was wearing a clean white boxers, bare-chested glistened on his toned chest, and Ruth felt her resolve begin to crumble. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," Ruth stammered, quickly averting her gaze. Peter smirked, stepping closer. "Relax, Ruth. It's just me." Ruth froze as Peter lifted her chin gently, forcing her to look into his eyes. "You don't have to fight it anymore," he whispered. "I know you want this as much as I do." "Stop, Peter," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper, but her body betrayed her, rooted to the spot. Peter leaned in, his lips inches from hers. Just as their faces were about to touch, Ruth suddenly pushed him away. "No!" she cried, her voice shaking. "I can't do this! Larry doesn't deserve this!" She ran out of the room, her heart racing with a mix of guilt and relief. Unbeknownst to Ruth, V had placed a hidden camera in Peter's room. The entire encounter had been recorded. Days later, V used Ruth's absence as an opportunity to execute her plan. Ruth had gone to the market, and Larry was home alone. V knocked on the door of his study, holding her phone tightly. "Larry, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice serious. Larry looked up, concerned. "What is it, V?" "You're such a good man," V began, sitting down across from him, "and I hate to be the one to tell you this, but Ruth doesn't deserve you." Larry frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Promise me you won't mention my name," V said, her voice low. "I don't want Ruth to know I told you this." Larry hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Okay, I promise." V took a deep breath. "Your wife is cheating on you with Peter." Larry froze, his face paling. "No. That can't be true." "I knew you wouldn't believe me," V said, pulling out her phone, "so I made sure to gather proof." She played the recording of Ruth's confession, followed by the video from Peter's room. Larry stared at the screen, his hands trembling. Tears streamed down his face as he watched his brother lean in toward Ruth. V made sure to cut the part where Ruth pushed him out. "Why?" Larry whispered, his voice breaking. "Why would she do this to me?" V leaned back, a triumphant smile hidden behind a mask of pity. "I'm so sorry, Larry. You deserve better." When Ruth came back from her walk, her heart sank as she stepped into the living room. Her suitcases were packed and placed neatly near the door. Larry stood by them, his eyes swollen and red with tears. He looked broken. What is this?" Ruth asked, her voice trembling as she stared at him. Larry's face twisted with pain as he looked at her. "I saw it, Ruth," he said, his voice cracking. "I saw everything. How could you? Of all people, my own brother?" Ruth froze in place, her breath catching in her throat. No, baby, please let me explain," she begged, her voice shaking with desperation. Larry shook his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Explain what? That you betrayed me? That the woman I gave everything to wants my brother instead of me?" His voice rose as anger and sorrow consumed him. "You both deserve each other. This marriage is over." "No, Larry, please," Ruth cried, falling to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand. It wasn't like that." Larry turned his face away, unable to bear looking at her. His hands trembled as he spoke. "I loved you, Ruth. I fought for you. But now I can't even stand the sight of you." He turned and walked away, leaving Ruth sobbing in the middle of the living room. V, watching from the hallway, smirked to herself. Stage 1 of her plan was complete. That evening, Larry locked himself in his room, drowning his pain in a bottle of whiskey. V saw her chance and knocked softly on his door. "Larry," she called gently. "It's me, V. Can I come in?" "Go away," Larry muttered, his voice slurred from the alcohol. V ignored him and pushed the door open. She stepped inside, wearing nothing but a short towel. "Why are you doing this to yourself, Larry?" she asked, her voice smooth and comforting. "For a woman who chose your brother over you? You deserve better." Larry sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. "Leave, V," he said weakly. But V walked closer, her eyes filled with fake sympathy. "Don't tell me you've been blind to see it," she said softly. "I'm in love with you, Larry. I've always been." Larry looked up at her, confused and hurt. "V, stop this nonsense." But V didn't stop. She let the towel drop to the floor, standing before him in an attempt to seduce him. "You don't have to be alone, Larry. Let me take care of you." Larry stood up abruptly, his eyes blazing with anger despite his drunken state. "Put your clothes back on," he growled. "Don't ever try this again, V, or I'll throw you out to the street this night." V quickly picked up the towel, covering herself in embarrassment. She hadn't expected him to resist her, but she wasn't giving up yet. As she turned to leave the room, Larry called her back. "And first thing in the morning, I need you to pack your things and leave my house." Meanwhile, Ruth had fled to her grandmother's house. She refused to eat or sleep, drowning in her own guilt and despair. Every day she cried herself into exhaustion. One evening her grandmother sat her down. "My child," she said softly, holding Ruth's hands, "Larry stood by you through everything. He fought for your love. Now it's time for you to fight back." Ruth looked at her grandmother with tear-filled eyes. "But Grandma, what can I do? I feel so lost. Even though the native doctor said I'm free, I don't feel free. It's like there's something inside me holding me back. I feel like ending it all." Her grandmother shook her head firmly. "Don't speak like that, Ruth. You are stronger than this. But you must fight, not just for your marriage, but for your soul." One night, as Ruth lay awake, crying her eyes out as usual, a notification suddenly popped up on her phone. It wasn't just a random online friend that usually shared a prayer link to her, but she had never bothered to open the link. But that night, as she was confused, exhausted, and didn't know what to do, she reluctantly opened the YouTube midnight prayer link and prayed with them that night. "God, please help me," she cried out in tears. "I have done everything in my power. Please step in. I'm losing my mind." She prayed and cried that night till she slept off the next morning, even though nothing happened, but she felt a bit at peace. Something she had never felt since the day that breaking of bond ritual was done. She continued joining that prayer session every night. Then one night, while praying, Ruth fell asleep. In her dream, she found herself standing in a dark, eerie place. She saw Larry kneeling before a massive, monstrous creature, tears streaming down his face. "Give me back what belongs to me," Larry pleaded, his voice filled with despair. The creature laughed mockingly. "Do you think I will ever leave my wife for you? You're a fool, Larry. I deceived you. I have your manhood, and I still have my wife. She will never love you." "I made her hate you. She will always be mine." Ruth gasped as she saw herself chained to a stone chair, looking weak and helpless, like a sacrifice waiting to be slaughtered. Larry cried out in agony as the creature loomed over him, its laughter echoing in the darkness. Ruth tried to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, a bright light pierced through the darkness. She turned, shielding her eyes, and saw a familiar figure. It was her late mother, glowing with warmth and strength. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. "Mama?" she whispered, tears welling up. Her mother smiled softly, carrying a basket full of items, tubers of yam, beautiful clothes, jewelry, and other things Ruth didn't recognize. "I have come to settle this once and for all," her mother said firmly. Before Ruth could respond, the monstrous creature growling angrily. "She belongs to me!" "No," her mother said boldly. "I am here to return her bride price. Her bride price was paid to me, so here I'm to return them and break every bond you have with her. Every tie you have with her is broken today." The creature laughed cruelly. "You think it's that easy? She will never leave me." But Ruth's mother stepped forward fearlessly. "Take these and give her back everything that belongs to her." She stretched out the basket to the creature. The monster hesitated, its eyes flickering with rage and fear. Slowly, it reached out its clawed hand, grabbed the basket, and snarled. Then, with a loud roar, it threw the items on the ground. "Fine!" it spat. "But she will regret this." The chains around Ruth suddenly shattered, and she felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. "Mama!" Ruth cried, running toward her mother, but the light grew brighter and everything disappeared. Ruth jumped up from bed as her phone rang loudly on the bedside table. She grabbed it, her hands shaking, and answered. "Hello?" she whispered. "It's back, babe! It's back!" Larry's voice boomed from the other end, filled with excitement and disbelief. What are you talking about?" Ruth asked, still groggy and confused. "My manhood, Ruth! It's back!" Larry shouted. "I don't know how, but I woke up and everything is back to normal." Ruth froze, the dream flashing in her mind. Tears filled her eyes as she realized the significance of what had just happened. "Larry, oh my God!" she whispered. The next day, Ruth packed her bags and returned home. As she stepped into the house, Larry ran to her, scooping her into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry, Larry," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I should have fought for us. I let myself get lost. But I'm here now, and I'll never leave again." They held each other tightly, both feeling a peace they hadn't felt in years. The dark cloud that had hung over their marriage was finally gone. Months later, Ruth discovered she was pregnant. The news brought endless joy to their home. When the baby was born, it was a beautiful little girl with bright eyes and a cheerful giggle. As Larry held their daughter for the first time, he looked at Ruth with tears in his eyes. "She's our miracle," he whispered. Ruth nodded, her heart full. "And she's a reminder that love, faith, and forgiveness can conquer even the darkest battles." From that day forward, their family lived in happiness, free from the chains of the past.